Good morning. Welcome back for our second panel of the day. We've had wonderful speakers, and you're going to hear some more illustrious speakers today. My name is Joy Downs-Young. I am a certified diabetes educator and a clinical research coordinator in the Department of Learning and Health Sciences at the medical school here. So the vision of learning health science, the system relies on a culture of responsibility, system trust, and trustworthiness, and on collaboration among stakeholders, including communities and patients. But how can we assure appropriate engagement throughout the processes of data collection, analysis, knowledge generation, and implementation, as well as responsiveness to the community? I'm really privileged to be able to introduce our speakers. These panelists share expertise in understanding the social relationships that underlie the culture of medicine and the practices of health research enterprise. They will help us define and recommend solutions to the pressing question of how can we ensure robust and equitable patient and community engagement in our learning health systems from the ground up. Our first speaker is Dr. Charles Bosk from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a little bit tall, so I'm going to try not to bend over too much. He is a professor of sociology and of anesthesiology and critical care at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He has books that we would all benefit from reading. One is What Could You Do? Juggling Bioethics and Ethnography, and one currently in progress entitled, What is a Medical Mistake? 40 Years Wondering. That's provocative. Dr. Bosk is a senior fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics and was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2013. Our second speaker is Dr. Richard Sharp. He is a director of the Biomedical Ethics Program at the Mayo Clinic. Prior to joining Mayo, he was the director of bioethics research at Cleveland Clinic and co-director of the bioethics of the Center for Genetic Research on Ethics and Law at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Sharp has served on advisory committees for the National Institute of Health, the Institute of Medicine, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Our third speaker is Dr. Kent Key. He is the director of the Office of Community Scholars and Partnerships at Michigan State College of Human Medicine in the Division of Public Health. Dr. Key is the Executive Deputy Director of Community-Based Organization Partners, an umbrella organization of more than 40 Flint community-based organizations. Immediately following the Flint disaster in 2016, Dr. Key and his colleagues brokered a collaborative effort among MSU, U of M, and the community-based organization partners to form the Healthy Flint Research Coordinating Center, where he is the core director. Joining Dr. Key is Ms. Yvonne Lewis, who is the founder and CEO of the National Center for African American Health Consciousness and co-director of the Healthy Flint Research Coordinating Center with Dr. Key. Ms. Lewis is also outreach director for the nonprofit Genesee Health Plan and is currently the chair of the board for the directors of the Genesee Community Health Center, federally qualified health center, as well as a member of other community-based organizations and advisory councils. She was previously the executive director of both the Universal Kidney Foundation and Faith Access to Community Economic Development. Our final colleague that's going to be our panel is Dr. Gretchen Piatt, who I have the pleasure of working for. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Health Sciences and Behavioral Health and Health Education in the University of Michigan School of Medicine and Public Health. Dr. Piatt completed her master's and doctoral training at the University of Pittsburgh in chronic disease epidemiology, and her work consists of designing and evaluating interventions for the primary and secondary prevention of diabetes and its complications. She will be joining us for the discussion portion of the panel. Dr. Bosk, you have the floor.
Thanks for the generous introduction. I know a lot of you are wondering how a sociologist gets to be a member of the Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care. It turns out I have a remarkable ability to transform or to turn rooms of 18 to 22-year-olds. The sound of my voice puts them to sleep. And so far as we know, there aren't the complications of other forms of anesthesia. I have nothing to disclaim other than I'm not going to talk about engagement. I thought I was when I was asked to speak. I'm actually going to talk more about what I think is a sloppiness and a looseness in speaking about systems. Speaking about learning health systems is a kind of horse I've been riding since the IOM report. I'm just going to shift some of the words I usually use when we talk about mistakes to now talking about learning. I have, by way of introduction, spent the last 5 years, or between 2011 and 2015, on an ARC-funded, as the ethnographer on an ARC-funded attempt to reduce surgical complications in 37 states, 2 countries, and 200 and some hospitals. That would seem to me to be a large effort at both quality improvement and learning, and it did not, well, it didn't, how shall I say, revitalize my faith in either systems or learning. Let's start with the National Academy of Medicine's definition. A learning health system is one in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned with continuous improvement and innovation, with best practices seamlessly embedded in the delivery process and new knowledge captured as an integral byproduct of the delivery experience. I think another way of saying that is that learning health systems are mythical beasts that apply best practices when they're known, their best guesses when they are not, and their best efforts to resolve uncertainty through sound clinical science. Problem being that we're not really sure what the rules for sound clinical science are, as we learned from the support study. A learning health system needs to keep inventing new sciences and bringing on new experts just to keep learning. I've often wondered, why do we need implementation science? I mean, exactly what is implementation science, and why isn't it actually implementation practice? Why do we need translational science? Don't people read the journals? And I mean, why do they need somebody to translate the journals? What in general is the place of organizational science, and who created it, and what makes you an expert in it? How is cognitive science at the individual level connected to organizational behavior at, I dare say, the organizational level? What kinds of experts does a learning health system need? What other sciences will we need to create? And why is it that we confuse data with information and transmission with communication? This is the wrong, I actually fixed that typo last night. So God knows what else is up here. But it does seem to me that whenever I hear somebody say to me in a learning health system, we just have too much data and we don't know where to even start to make sense of it, it seems to me that somebody hasn't asked the first question, which is what kind of information do we need to make sound decisions, not what kind of and then we'll get the data from that. We rather gather the data and then say, well, what kind of questions can we ask, or what kinds of information do we have here? That's backwards. Of course, the lessons that experience teaches are open to interpretation. But when I thought I had longer than 15 minutes, I was going to play a clip here from Leonard Cohen singing The Sisters of Mercy with a keyed to McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where it isolates the story of, for those of you that haven't seen the movie, of the cowboy played by Keith Carradine and the punk that shoots them as he's walking across a bridge, where each have learned two very different systems. Each have been in the same system. Each have learned two very different lessons about behavior in that system. So there's a difference between, and I find this twice a year at least, every time I grade papers, there is a very large gap between what I think I have taught to my students and what they tell me they have learned. And there's no reason not to expect that in a learning health system as well. So can we provide the best technical care? And then is the best technical care, and this is the quote from the Sisters of Mercy, does the best technical care bind you with love that's graceful and green at the stem? How do you teach a system to be human? If to err is human, then it follows that a system that is error-free, and I use that term to evoke the recent election, is no longer human. I think there's something quixotic and contradictory, and perhaps nobly so, in trying to create a patient-centered delivery system that reduces preventable adverse events, provides for shared decision-making, and does that through impersonal, objective processes that treats each patient the same. And it also follows for me that some preventable adverse events are actually the result of honoring patient preferences. So do we agree on what lessons a learning health system needs to learn in order to teach people in it to learn? We base decisions on the best available evidence, but it seems to me that it's important to recognize that the best available evidence is not the same thing as adequate evidence. Sometimes the problem is the absence of a randomized clinical trial. Here we can look at the problems with hormone replacement therapy, but sometimes the problem is an excessive appropriation of a poorly conducted randomized clinical trial. And I did a paper on the preoperative beta blockades, a top 2 in 2002 recommendation from ARC as a patient safety measure based on a single clinical trial that in my mind, A, should never been approved by its IRB. It didn't use an intent to treat design, exposed patients to excessive risk because it randomized patients already on propranolol to the control arm where they didn't get the propranolol, then should never have been accepted by the New England Journal of Medicine because it didn't follow its statistical guidelines, then was adopted by at the last minute by a guidelines task force after the report was written as an addendum by the 2 committee chairs. It was randomization. It works really well with large samples, but it introduces bias if you're doing studies that randomizes 60 patients to a control arm, 60 patients to a treatment arm. The beta blocker recommendation was based by our count on 240 patients, and it was another 8,800 patients before enough data was collected to change the recommendation. So I think we need to learn how systems learn These are, this is shameless self-promotion. These are two very short and useful pieces, I think, that appeared in Lancet that I happen to author. The first is called Reality Check for Checklists, and the second is called Medicine in the Radiant City, where the radiant city reflects Le Corbusier notions of city planning and what the anthropologist James Scott calls the aesthetic of high modernism. I believe we're operating with an aesthetic of high modernism here. So let me talk quickly about checklists and CLABSI, partly because it's the keystone study done in the state of Michigan, and I think it's a classic case of overgeneralization. I should say the surgical study that I worked on with Pranavost's group. I think there are multiple ways to reduce the rate of CLABSI. You could follow the steps of the Keystone Project. You could follow only those steps that made sense in a local context, because after all, there's no way to distinguish which parts of the CLABSI intervention contributed to the reduction of CLABSI and which did not. You could stop sending tips and peripheral blood samples to labs for culturing, treat all infections empirically, and drive your CLABSI rate down to nothing, or you could place fewer central lines. And that brings us to what I think of as, within any learning system, the fundamental paradox of safety and quality improvement. No doubt, standardization, simplification of complex processes improve performance. Same time, that standardization and simplification encourage mindless following of routine work processes. Mindless following of routines creates conditions that are conducive to a loss of situational awareness, and a loss of situational awareness increases the likelihood of mistakes. So the better you train your people to follow routines, you need to also build in, and also while you're following those routines, think occasionally. So designed or planned social order, which it seems to me is what learning health systems are about, is schematic. It ignores essential features of any real functioning social order. This is the product of German scientific forestry, okay? German scientific forestry was adopted to make calculable the yields of wood in the king's forests, or the prince's forest. I forget what year it was, so I forget whether Germany was yet a state and whatever. But I want to ask a couple of questions. In the scientific forest, it's quite easy to see the trees, but where is the forest? Do forests have broad alleys to stroll through? Does anything about this forest suggest nature at work? Is there anything human or natural? I mean, there's much human, but is there anything natural in that picture? For Le Corbusier, a house is a machine for living, but who wants to live in a machine? And bioinformatics removes disease from individuals. I'm going to do it. And places it in population. The issue is, do we have a method for recognizing that diseases still happen to people in populations? Will the order of a learning health system recreate all the problems of the German scientific forest by refusing, in its focus on systems, to acknowledge local contexts, particular concerns of communities, and the fact that we speak broad? How many learning health systems are there at the University of Michigan? Is there one? Is it part of a national learning health system? Or does urology have a different learning health system than pathology, which is different than pediatrics? Do they talk to each other? What do we mean when we talk about a learning system? Systems don't learn squat. People learn. And what we ought to talk about is how to teach people to function in systems rather than pretending that it's the system doing the learning rather than the people that are doing the learning. Thank you.
thank you, and thank you for the introduction earlier. I very much appreciate that and appreciate the opportunity to be here, though I always feel a little uncomfortable when I visit the campus as a Michigan State alumnus. I feel a little awkward. I wonder if something bad's going to happen to me here. So I had nothing to do with anything that happened in football last year. I won't even go there today. So appreciate the opportunity, and my talk's going to be really quite different. I am going to talk a little bit about engagement and no financial relationships to disclose. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the chaos of trying to conduct community engagement in the context of big data research. And I just love this figure, so I had to put it up there. I'm not going to spend any time on this either, but it just really is a wonderful graphic there. So I'm going to talk about a question that is, I think, going to be a critical one as these large data sets continue to be created and inform the ways in which we deliver care in large academic health centers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a good steward of the kinds of data sets that are being created. And in that context, I think some element of that answer to that question is going to have to include a commitment to trying to engage members of our local communities in dialogue about appropriate use of those data sets. And here, in this regard, I think there's a lot of lessons that we might learn from experiences that have been established in the context of large DNA biobanks. And what I'm hoping to do in my remarks is to say a little bit about the kinds of engagement activities that we've structured at the Mayo Clinic, because I do think that there are several shared common challenges that you see in structuring community engagement in that setting that can inform the way in which we reach out to communities in the context of these large data sets. And I want to be candid at the outset that I think there are some shared lessons here, but I also think that there's a number of cautionary points. And I want to conclude on a couple of those cautionary points because I do think that the challenges here may not be resolvable. They might not be easy to answer at all. So let me start with a little bit of history about our biobank at Mayo Clinic. We have had a biobank in place now for roughly 7 years. Eligibility for our biobank is limited only to adult patients. They have to be established at Mayo Clinic, live in the United States, and able to provide informed consent. The vast majority of them are English speaking in some manner or another, but we do have individuals that may have more limited English proficiency. They're asked to provide consent in writing. They generally do this by mail. In the earliest stages of our biobank, we approach people individually and we're doing an in-person consent. The feedback we received was that this was a large waste of time from participants that were being enrolled. They wondered, why do I have to schedule a separate appointment and come in to talk with someone about this project? Can I do this by mail? We then shifted over and then began to do informed consent through that process. They complete a very detailed health survey. This typically takes them approximately an hour to do, so this is a very detailed set of information we collect from them. They then provide, I believe it is now 6 separate tubes of blood using different anticoagulation methods and so forth that let us utilize those biological materials for a range of different types of studies. And very important for this discussion, they give us permission to go back into their health records and to pull information from their health record, combine it with the samples that they've donated for the purpose of doing medical research. We do provide an option for future contacts, and many investigators ask permission from us to contact those individuals. The biobank then reaches out on behalf of the investigator, so no one gets that information directly until a participant essentially consents into that secondary study that's being done. We also then follow up with them periodically and collect additional data. So in many ways, you can see here elements of a learning health system in a small scale reflected in the project that we have here. As of the end of June of this year, we have approximately 55,000 people who've enrolled in the biobank. The gap here is that many of them have consented but not yet completed either the phlebotomy or the survey associated with the work. Many of those individuals are older individuals that have been established patients at Mayo Clinic for some time. And in terms of the national dispersion of our sample, as you might imagine, many of these folks are coming from the upper Midwest, shown in the darkened colors here, but our catchment area is actually a national catchment at Mayo Clinic, and so we do include large numbers of patients that are coming from other parts of the country as well. The individuals, as I mentioned, are often established patients, and in terms of the overall length of the electronic health record associated with these patients, the median is well over 15 years. And so this becomes an incredibly useful resource for us as we're thinking about the kinds of medical studies that would be enabled by this. If we want to know about the status of women who've had breast cancer but their primary cancer was 10 years ago, we can actually identify a cohort of individuals like that without having to essentially screen very large numbers of individuals. And I think we've tried to take advantage of that aspect of our biobank in the studies that we've focused on. So in the context of a large collection like this, established over many years, there are several challenges I want to mention that I think are especially apt here. One of which has to do with the practicality of structuring community engagement. So if you think about that map that I just showed a moment ago, if we wanted to organize a group of individuals to come together and talk about a new research study that's being done, how would we do that? Right? We have people from all over the country. We could surely structure some sort of online process for that, but that's not going to create the kind of dynamic that we normally think of when we're talking about a robust community engagement process that might involve dialogue and extended interactions and people learning about that research study and providing an informed perspective back to us. So I think as these collections become larger and larger, the challenges of structuring and engagement become more difficult. How do we engage these folks not just over time, but over large geographic distance? And lastly, there's the challenge of scope of consent, something that I know the afternoon panel is going to talk a little bit about. But in the context of our biobank, we really had to ask this question: how do we deal with the issue of the specificity of the permissions that we're seeking, when a part of the permission that we were seeking was ongoing access to their electronic health record? So if I say today, I'm okay giving you a blood sample, I'm okay signing this consent form, and I recognize that you're going to pull out of my health record all sorts of information that might be relevant to a study that you're doing. And next year, I develop schizophrenia, and a condition that I might consider to be highly stigmatizing. That might completely change the way in which I might think about your access to my health record. If I were asked again a year from now, I might very well say no, because of the fact that now there's information in there that I'm more concerned about. So how do we manage the fact that it's not just our capacity to do research studies that's changing, it's not just our understanding of disease that's changing, but it's my condition as a participant in these collections that's changing as well. And situationally, my assessment of the risks and benefits of participation can change dramatically over time. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that, and there have been many things that have been proposed. There's been proposals that we go back and renew consent when we anticipate that there may be some controversy or some unanticipated risks. Proposals to make certain types of studies subject to a lower bar for consent and so forth. But what we did instead, recognizing this key tension between allowing individuals and to enroll in these kinds of collections at large volume, right, knowing that you have to have a certain generic process here, but also wanting to protect them against the kinds of harms that I was just mentioning a moment ago, what we did is we established an oversight structure that involved community advisory boards. And so for us, we see our community advisory board network not as about identifying unmet community needs and trying to tailor the research we do to meeting those needs, but we see it as a governance structure, as an oversight or a stewardship mechanism. In addition, since many biobanks have been criticized or specific concerns have been raised about biobanks, we see this as a mechanism for addressing some of those specific concerns. So for example, is it appropriate to use materials in our collection for commercial purposes? That was something that we anticipated could come up, but initially we restricted the use of our materials only to Mayo Clinic investigators. Over time, as the collection has grown, we've had a number of overtures from companies who are interested in partnering with us. We were able to take that issue to our group of advisors and get input on that. In fact, in that setting, it required a great deal of education about how monies flow in the context of research studies. And what we did, among other things, was we asked them to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which allowed us to share the details of our budget at a very granular level with them, to share details of various business plans that had been proposed and various relationships that had been discussed in the context of specific companies. And so it is possible, I think, to use these kinds of advisory mechanisms to explore very complex and controversial issues once they're established. Other things that we've talked about had to do with data ownership and transfer of ownership to other entities, pooling those data into national collections, for example, and so forth. So with regard to how we think about ethical stewardship in the context of our biobank, we think minimally that any mechanism that's set up to sort of involve members of the community ought to consider how to minimize the risks associated with participation in these collections, how to ensure good alignment between the goals of the research that you're conducting and the intent of the individual sample donors. Similarly, alignment of community goals and interests with the work that we're facilitating, and promoting transparency with regard to sample usage. And this is probably, in my opinion, the area where there's the greatest amount of lesson to be learned for learning health systems, right? The controversies that have been associated with biological sample collections, the Henrietta Lacks story, the Havasupai controversy, and so forth, at the end of the day are controversies that are rooted in a lack of transparency, that a community or a family or an individual is finding out secondhand that materials that they donated with one intention in mind actually ended up being used for a very different purpose. And so I think that ethical stewardship demands a commitment to transparency, and that informed consent is a very poor mechanism for trying to achieve that particular goal. Instead, what we need to do is we need to structure these advisory networks, community engagement activities that better facilitate disclosure to communities. So let me just end with a couple quick comments related to our advisory board network. We've had an advisory board in Rochester, Minnesota now since 2010. That board meets 5 to 6 times per year. It's advised us on a whole variety of different topics, including some of the ones that I was just mentioning, but also including things like whether or not our collection should do whole genome sequencing on the 55,000 samples that we have. And if we did that, how would we make decisions about offering selective results back to those individuals? Our network is expanded now beyond Rochester to include groups in Florida and Arizona, where there's also large collection activities taking place. The group that meets in Arizona is actually connected to a federally qualified health center called Mountain Park Healthcare, and the majority of the patients that they serve in that context are Spanish-speaking individuals that receive their care in the context of this free clinic network. And so in that context, we have a very different set of concerns that are coming from the community, and our network is nicely positioned to be able to have that dialogue as well. I think there's lots of value. Again, I'm not going to go through this slide because I think most of the folks in this room would readily appreciate that. But if the challenge of sort of maintaining transparency is partly an educational one, one of the things that our advisory board really helps us with is finding creative ways to do education within the community so that more and more people locally are informed about the work that we're doing and ultimately have a more informed perspective on the potential value of that work. So lastly, 2 or 3 key lessons for this audience. First is that I think similar to the work that we've done, most people are not going to be familiar with the activities of a learning health system. They're going to be confused about boundaries between research and patient care activities, for example. These distinctions that we draw between quality improvement and clinical research are not going to be distinctions that are going to matter to most lay people. If they're morally important distinctions, we have to clarify for them why they're distinctions that matter. Communities are inherently pluralistic. When we talk about representation of individuals from the community on our board, we often struggle to flesh out what exactly does that mean. Is it traditional distinctions between racial and cultural communities that we may have in mind, or is there a different type of representation that comes into play in the context of clinical research activities? And then the challenge that I think, again, I've already alluded to is that engagement activities are usually done best in the context of local relationships. We get to know individuals within the community. We hear them. We interact with them. We share communities with them. We share living activities with them. Engagement, when it's done well, I think is a very highly localistic activity. But learning health systems are going to pool data across very large networks of providers, right? And those networks are going to themselves be pooled into additional collections. So your Ann Arbor collection becomes part of the University of Michigan catchment area, which becomes part of a large data mart that might exist at a national level, which might ultimately be part of an international collection of data. And so in that context, what does it mean to still do community engagement when the community is the global community? And it's that point, unfortunately, that I want to leave you with. It's a little bit cynical, but I do think that it highlights the ways in which, as we grow up the scale of these activities, how we think about community engagement has to change. And I believe it has to change in the direction of almost looking to political entities that might serve as the mediums through which we engage communities, where you have political representatives who are voted in, who are themselves identified members and spokespeople on behalf of individual communities through some political process. And in the clinical research world, we haven't necessarily thought about the complexities of that kind of representation of community leadership. So I'll leave you on that point. Thank you.
Good morning. This is amazing. My heart is literally pounding. I had absolutely no idea what this would be like, but it's great. I am appreciative of being here today with Dr. Key. I'm here because of Dr. Key, so we're going to blame it on him. But we want to just say to you this morning that personally we have no what's the word? No conflicts to disclose. So we just want to just talk with you for a few minutes here. So I was really excited to, I'm going to use the right one. Okay. All right, we're going to get together here. When we talked to Joden about this, and we really had some conversation because I personally wasn't quite clear what Dr. Key was getting me involved in. And I say that jokingly because we do this to each other. We get each other involved in things, and they say, what did we do? But we really wanted to focus in on sustainable community engagement in a constantly changing health system and what that means. Because sometimes when we talk about community, it is, and I think it was mentioned before, it's very broadly defined. But what's so wonderful about this opportunity today is that broad definition is going to really work for us. And we appreciate those who came before us to kind of set this conversation up. So we're going to share community perspective, and we say perspective intentionally because we cannot speak all of the intentions, the understanding of the various cultures and the various persons that encompass the many kinds of communities that are engaged in the health system. And so we just want you to keep that in mind. We're speaking of it from a perspective. In a constantly changing system, there are four goals we want to talk to you about today. We want to give you a little bit of a historical context of how we talk about community engagements, especially as it relates to the ethical and legal and social implications in a changing world. Share perspective of the community as a continuum of community engagement, provide some concepts of how we will engage communities in the health system, and ultimately we have some recommendations. I'm excited because today in this room with me are two people that actually got me involved in the first conversation I ever had around ethical, legal, and social implications of anything, and it was around genomics. I was fortunate to be invited by Toby Cintron to Washington, D.C. when Francis Collins was at the helm of the ship, and they talked about the completion of the human genome. And Vince Bonham was also there. He was working at Michigan State, and we worked on a couple of projects that looked at how do we inform and educate a community around this big issue of genetics. And one thing was really, really important. So how do people in communities understand this? And so we had a series of dialogues, and in some of those conversations, it was really what is morally right about this or wrong about it? What's legally right or wrong about it, and how does that impact me as an individual, my family, and those who I live, work, worship, and play with? We had a number of projects. One of them included a genetics education among African Americans and Latino Hispanics. And what does that mean? Because there are different cultural contexts within which these things play out, and how do we give consideration to those conversations? And then it expanded. We were part of a national community committee for the Prevention Research Centers, and we talked about this at a national level across communities, 30 different communities across the nation that were part of the Prevention Research Centers. And that led to the community members themselves saying, what do we do and how do we help inform communities? So there were several regions that did educational programs. And so there was one hosted in the Midwest region by community, for community, with national involvement. And so we've been at this for a little while, but we also still have the question of understanding what community means and how do people understand community and how do we engage community. So Dr. Key is going to talk to you a little bit about how community is defined, some research defined, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Yvonne. So the first thing that we have to look at is when we look at community engagement, let's define community. So in a learning health system, what does that look like? Oftentimes in community engaged research, community can be defined very narrowly or very broadly. So in a learning health system, it may include researchers embedded in the system, clinicians, insurance providers, but then we also advocate for patients, family, and caregivers to be a part of that. We should identify what types of research that we're going to apply the community engagement continuum to, empirical, implied, et cetera. And then we want to define clear research objectives related to assess the effectiveness of how we engage the set community in the health system. So the other thing is your ability to engage community may directly affect the quality of the information that may be produced within your learning health system. So let's keep that in mind as we look at this spectrum. So examining a community engaged continuum from a research perspective looks like this. On the far left, you'll find more traditional approaches to a research model where community has little say in research questions, designs, or approaches. And the community's role in this scenario is predominantly as the subject or the participant. In an academically driven scenario, you may have a little bit more involvement with community. Maybe you have a CAB or an advisory board, but it's not necessarily placed in the community, and most of the time the community may respond to surveys or research models like that, but it's not really inclusive fully of the community. Then when we move forward towards a more community-placed engagement, we see community advisory boards more involved, a little bit more discussion around the research project, and then they're actually placed somewhere in the local vicinity of the community. So it's not necessarily a phone survey or an online survey, but actually people are communing within the context of the physical geographic location of a community. Then we have a community partner research where community is derived from a partnership between the community and the researcher. And at this point, the community has input in research, possibly may have a little suggestions around the design, but in most cases not involved in the other critical phases of the research, such as the data analysis and the dissemination of the findings and the translation of the findings, which is also key. Finally, near the right of the spectrum where we kind of talk about community-based participatory research, it's a point where engagement with community is involved in all phases of the research process. That includes setting the agenda for the research project, identifying the research question, the approach, and the design, but also in the co-ownership of the data, translation, and of the findings. Now, I'm not inferring that this endpoint on this continuum will be fully applicable to a learning health system, yet the possibility is there. Consider the benefit of a learning health system where full community engagement at all levels and at all points of engagement. What would that learning health system look like? Every place where a patient, a family member, or a caregiver interacts is a point of engagement within the learning health system. Thus, it is important to engage community at all levels. So there are some benefits specifically for community engagement as we try to apply them to a learning health system. There's research questions and learning objectives that are more relevant and meaningful, enhanced system design and delivery that are culturally appropriate, building the capacity of both individuals within the academic sphere and in the community partners, increasing likelihood that research results are translated and disseminated to participants, but most of all to members of the community, and then foster shared commitment that can lead to implementation.
So what are some connections for us? Now, one of the things that's critical, we found very, very critical in engaging community is to be sure that we define things. We all have heard words that we really think we understand and we have a definition for, and we go to a meeting like this and we learn something totally different. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk about this in the context of my experience as a community member going out to work to engage healthcare providers. So I was working at a nonprofit community organization as a foundation looking at chronic kidney disease, and I went to talk to one of our healthcare providers, and I asked them about partnering with us. And so they said, well, do you know anything about meaningful use? I knew I was set up. So I honestly said, no, have no idea. So it's important to define the term. So I just put this definition here because I'm sure you probably already know it, but I needed to understand what did meaningful use mean. Now, I really simplified it and said it simply means taking all of this electronic information that the government had paid some institutions for and making sure that it had value to the patients, or those who were being provided the service. So I had to make it real simple for myself. So then, this whole notion of the electronic health record, what does that mean? It's a digital version of patient's chart on a piece of paper. Now, you may know what that means, but when I come into your office and you're giving it to me, I may have absolutely no idea what that means. So then the electronic medical record. So what does that mean? Tracks what's happening to you over time. So how does that translate into what it means for me? Continuous quality improvement, research, evaluation. All of these things are important, and you know about them. I have no idea what you may be talking about. So I did this. So let's team up and have a team approach to addressing this. And if I can do this very, very quickly, this gets really confusing sometimes to people. If I had my preference, I would have 3 more triangles with each one, and that would probably be very confusing. Why would I do that? Because there are roles for the patient in this process. There are roles for the provider in this process, and there's also a role for the information. So if we could just take this right quickly, and you see these arrows are going back and forth. So the patient at this point is the community. And if we say this is going to be a learning system and the community is going to have involvement, what's the conversation? Uh-oh. Oh, go back. Uh-oh. Keep talking. Let me keep talking. You work that. Okay. So what's the connection between the patient or that community and that provider as it relates to the electronic medical record? Am I really being informed about what that is and how it can, what does it mean to me? And if you're listening to what it means to me, and then you're translating it into how it can improve that record, then there is some triangulation between the meaningful use of that electronic medical record, the electronic health record, and what happens in the life of that patient. And that's a continuous process. Then we jump over to the other side, continuous quality improvement, doing that all the time. But this suggests, from the research perspective, typically we do research and we wait to the end, we evaluate it, hurrah, we've got something, let's go do it. This suggests that as the research is going on, if in fact there is something that will improve what's happening in my life or the life of the community, let's evaluate it at that point and make some course corrections and include that in the process so that the continuous quality improvement not only happens at the end when we've done all the things that we think we can do, but it happens in the process. So, in order to make this happen, can you do that for me, my brother? Because I'm excited here, and I only have I don't have trust cannot happen. None of this, and you've heard it from the beginning. Trust, and you see the arrows going both ways. That's intentional. Trust is in the middle. Patient, provider, researcher, anesthesiologist, whatever it is. I must trust that you hear me. And then I must trust that you can translate that to others that you will work with on my behalf. Because this record then can be used, it should be used by specialists, if I have to see one, somebody else who is in the process of engaging in my care that you may have the opportunity to communicate with that I may never see initially. Because if there's research going on in the lab and all of that wonderful clinical stuff that people are doing, and I don't have access to that conversation, I must depend on you then to share that information and then bring it back. Equally important, then we on the community side, it's important for us to have enough knowledge and confidence in sharing the information, as you mentioned before, all over the world, then we can go and share that and build up our ability, our capacity to have cross communications, in which sometimes we use the term cross-fertilization. It isn't enough for, and I know I hear this a lot, so this is my thing. This is coming directly from me. It isn't enough for it to be bi-directional, such that you're hearing me and you say, okay, I heard you and I got it. It has to be cross-fertilization. You have to then, like the trees, not just let it grow any kind of way, but it has to begin to become a part of who you are and what you do on a regular basis, because as it was said, the system itself, the hospital bed and going down on the cart, that's not making a difference. It's the interaction between the patient, the orderly, the folks that fix the food and bring it to the table for people to eat, whatever that is, that trust is so important. So we want to leave you with this, to recommendations. Utilize the concepts of community engagement as a continuum. Communities are complex, and there are communities within communities. There's cultural contexts even within ethnic communities that create changes in the environment of how things are communicated. So we want to identify ways to include the patient or the community at every possible level. That means as you're doing your work, you have to determine, and my time is up, how you can do that. It's a thoughtful process. Inform and advise the patient of their options and opportunities to be included, provide education. You can read the rest of these. The bottom line is we have to communicate effectively. We have to trust that communication and be aware that there are differences even within the context of that communication, and how do we make it work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and impassioned presentation, all of you. So as we start our panelists' conversation, I want to just highlight a couple of words that were brought out that really give some of the concepts and underlie them. SIGFRI, the air is human, the system's also air. The individual, stewardship, transparency, community, global, community continuum, and the possibility of the LHS being fully integrated in the community and all undergirded by trust. So with that, let's start our panel discussion. So what I'd like to start with is, and this is to all of you on the panel, what's the first step? What is the first step to beginning community engagement so that it's a robust engagement to make the system as effective as possible for the community? That may be starting at the bedside, it might be out in the community, it might be at a committee meeting.
I would say first recognize that there's value in the community's engagement, because if there's no recognition that there's value, even at the bedside, there'll never be a question.
If I could echo that, quality improvement projects that are done within organizations ought to be done on problems that people in the organization feel are important, or else they won't be engaged. So quality improvement that comes very far away from the bedside very often targets something that nobody at the bedside feels is important, and then folks wonder, why couldn't we get more people involved? And the answer is simple. You didn't hit them where they lived.
I would also like to say that it's important to have dialogue with community so community can understand the importance of being engaged in these conversations. When we talk about the historical issues that have happened to certain marginalized communities being a part of any type of research process. And even going to the doctor, for many, there's still levels of trust. There's still levels of anxiety around that. I know people who are well educated and have college degrees, and they still won't go to the doctor on a regular basis, and when they do go, they're in the emergency room because they let it get that far. So we need to talk about the importance of being involved and engaged in these types of health systems and in the medical community, so that the community can understand not only does their voice matter, but we need to get them there to actually hear their voice.
So I'd like to reiterate what the other panelists have said. All of the research that I do is in the community. And the very first thing I would suggest, like what Dr. Key said, was that you have to talk to the people in the community. And I always tell, when I talk with them, I always make the point that I don't know your community. I don't live there. They're the ones that know the community. They're the ones that know what's important in the community. They're the ones that know what can be done in terms of getting uptake into the learning health system or not getting uptake into the learning health system. So I guess that's what I would see as the number one starting point into engaging the community in the learning health system, is to just talk to them and figure out and find out what's important to them.
If I could maybe just add a comment from a researcher's point of view, or someone who's coming from a medical institution. I think the starting point for these conversations always has to be one of humility. Going to the community and engaging people, recognizing that they have a great deal to add, that we may live our lives in ways that reflect kind of the expertise that we bring, but that starting with the stance that I'm an expert, I'm here to engage you, I want you to help me to do more with my research, is always a losing starting spot, right? I think you have to go in with an attitude of humility, that you are learning from the people that you're talking with, and that they have an expertise that they're bringing to the table. And maybe the hardest thing sometimes is to find out when you structure that conversation in the right ways. And I think one of the ways that we've sort of used as our benchmark on that is, do people tell us things that make us uncomfortable in these meetings? And when they do, we start to realize, oh, they get it. They're empowered in ways that the tables are shifting a little bit here. And now they're talking with us in ways that are sharing a more authentic opinion about our institutions, about us, the work we do, and so forth, that fully is reflective of that. So for us, we didn't think we were succeeding in our engagement activities until people really started to tell us some things that were quite harsh and difficult to hear. But in a way, that means that we're really having a conversation, a genuine conversation.
Thank you. We have some questions from our audience. Why don't we start over here, sir?
Okay. Community engagement. Interesting word. I was giving that some thought, and I was thinking, like, maybe who came up with that word, community engagement? It must have been a guy, because I don't know too many women who wants to be engaged, right? And so with that said, I'm just wondering what comes after engagement, because that's all we hear, engagement. And so I'm just putting that out there to you guys.
So when's the wedding, right? I think the next step after engagement is obviously to form partnerships. And, for lack of a better way to describe it, it's like, you are forming a partnership with these folks in the community. That's something, as a researcher here at U of M, I work in Flint, I work in Detroit, I work in Toledo, and sometimes those partnerships are formal, where there are signatures involved, and sometimes they're not formal. But I would say after you engage, you have to partner.
At the mic over here.
Yeah, I want to thank the panel for the very informative and stimulating presentations. My question is, what can medicine and public health learn from other industries or enterprises that have had to consider these issues of engaging their stakeholders, meaningfully dialoguing with them, assessing and updating preferences over time? It seems like this is certainly not unique to medicine or public health. So I'm interested if the panel feel like we could learn some lessons from well outside of our domains here.
Appreciate the question. A few years ago, our group did a project in which we were looking at the ways in which medical institutions respond to incidents of public scandal. So if an individual is in a clinical trial and dies in that trial and that becomes the subject of a media report, how do medical institutions respond to that? And what we did was we brought together people that were in non-medical industries to talk with us about that. And there are lots of lessons, I think, to be learned. So the airline industry, for example, my apologies to my fellow travelers this afternoon, but when the flights go down and there's a crash, right, most of us will get on a plane the next morning or later that week, right? How is that possible, right, given the fact that it's so, foregrounded in our thinking and so forth? What do they do differently that somehow manages to restore public confidence and to do that so quickly? And when we brought these people together, what they told us is that you don't want to begin your engagement activities at the time when you need something, right? You don't want to go there saying, I'm writing this grant, I want to get to know you, right? You don't want to go there and say, we've had a lot of scandals at our university, which are because of the result of a lack of transparency. We want you to help us to fix that problem, okay? You need to engage your local constituents, your local communities very early and in an authentic and genuine way to say, we don't have all the answers. We're looking for ways to develop new relationships. It's not about anything in particular. It's about setting the stage for a healthier relationship. And I think that was one of the things that we took away from those discussions.
I think of a couple of industries, actually, that you are very familiar with. One that we had some challenges with and continue, and that's the tobacco industry. I think the tobacco industry is one of the most culturally competent industries in the world, because everywhere you go, they figure out how to get the community of interest, whether it's from an age perspective, a gender perspective, or an ethnic perspective, to do what they want. Because they not only study the community, but they come in, we don't even know who they are. They're so incognito, but they're talking to community all the time. And the other industry is McDonald's. Everywhere you go, say, buy a Big Mac, right? You would think after all this time, everybody knows to buy a Big Mac, but do they discontinue their advertising? So one of the questions I've always asked is, why isn't the public health community engaging in that kind of work that continues to put forward in front of the people? It's advertising about quality health. When you speak about engagement, many times in that engagement process, you still kind of court a little bit. Problem when you get married, some people feel like they don't have to do what they did while they were engaged. So we want to be continually engaged in the process.
These are great questions. We have another question over here.
Yes, ma'am. The word community is being used, it seems in a sort of an implied way. And Dr. King, while you were talking about community, getting out into the community and interacting with folks. I'm a consumer advocate. I founded the MARC, stands for the Mutual Autism Research and Care Community. And I think as we get closer and closer to using precision medicine to identify populations that can be treated, the idea of interacting with them in the sense of community that, McDonald's is selling well to the autism community is not real. So I'm curious and emboldened by the statement of the researcher to say, how do we define community in such, and do we need to get more precise when we're talking specific communities along the treatment spectrum?
This whole notion of defining community is really up in debate in a lot of different sectors. You're absolutely right. What may happen in one sector with community or defining or engaging looks totally different in another. Most recently, I know with NCATS and with the IOM report, when it was reported that we were to use a more broadly definition of community, and even more marginalized community. Traditionally, in many areas or in many respects, when we talked about community, when it came to research, we talked about underrepresented, under-resourced, underprivileged communities, and now everyone's a community. There are communities of nurses, there are communities of pediatricians, and if you talk to a lot of grassroots residents, they feel like that shift has happened because more dollars were being earmarked for communities. So there are a lot of different perspectives on this, and I think right now we have to feel our way as we go, because like I said before, depending on what sector you're working in, you would have a different approach to that and a different strategy for your engaging of that particular set community.
And one other concept is engage the members of the families who are responsible for the individuals who cannot speak for themselves. So much of the work we do, we talk about being a voice for those who do not have voice until we can build the capacity for them to do so. And in some cases, it's not possible, but if you work closely enough with those who are connected, you get a sense of what that is because they're also living that experience.
I want to switch for a moment just to a hospital community, and I want to talk about a study that I was involved in, which was a 3-year study of the impact of the 80-hour work week, or regulations limiting work weeks to 80 hours, because when I talk to civilians about it, they would say, the 80-hour work week, that's horrible, when are they going to fix it? One of the things that we found was when we asked residents about the 80-hour, about how their work was affected, they would describe the system in the hospital as an opponent that kept them from getting their work done. From any outsider perspective, residents in a hospital are part of the hospital community. These residents felt outside of any system or community that was guiding their work. And so just the, now with virtual communities, symbolic communities, identity politics, internet communities, the defining community is a job I'm going to leave to some other sociologist, because it's just not, plausible.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for being here today. So Dr. Bosk, one of the last things you said was how many learning health systems are there? And in 2 of the presentations, it said, I think there were slides that said learning health care systems. So I guess my question to the entire panel is, at what point do we start making the distinction that there are multiple health or learning health systems, or multiple systems within health that we need to start focusing on, such as learning health care and health in the community, or health prevention systems?
I'm not a big fan of the word system, in part because once I was a student of Talcott Parsons a long, long time ago, and one of the things that I learned was that every system could be broken down into a subsystem and analyzed, and that subsystem could be analyzed as a system, and every subsystem could be analyzed as yet another system, and you could just constantly, break it down. We are, as a session, one system in a day of system-organized presentations. How they will tie together, God only knows, but it'll be a large synthetic act that each of you will do individually. Systems aren't natural. They don't have boundaries. We create them in order to make order, in order to define rules. And the world is poorly aligned with our notion of systems. The average 75-year-old has 3 to 5 chronic conditions, each of which has its own independent evidence-based guideline, because we do the guidelines one disease at a time. Our talk about systems are not well aligned with the world that we live in. And that was partly what was the inspiration for calling them a mythical beast.
think that goes back to what each of the panelists brought was the individual is the person that we need to really focus on, and within that individual, they belong to a community, and trust needs to be integrated throughout all of those. And so systems and communities can be very, very conceptual words, but it gets down to the person, who that person is, and how do we relate to them in a humble way and keep stewardship over those relationships. So, on this side, sir?
He was next.
Thank you.
Great presentations. I have a question for Ms. Lewis and Dr. Key and anyone else who wants to comment on it. The Precision Medicine Initiative is going to involve a cohort of 1 million people across the country. Dr. Sharp raised a question at the end of his presentation about global big data projects. Do you have any suggestions on how you apply the principles that you so articulately spoke of in those cases of huge projects where the community in one case is the whole country and in another case is the entire world?
Well, we talked about that at the CTSA meeting. We were in a focus group around precision medicine, and we were having that dialogue. I think there are set principles of engagement that can be used, whether it's a smaller group that's being engaged, like a family or a neighborhood, or whether it's a more larger context, such as an entire country. And again, starting with communication and having clear understanding about what it is that you're trying to do or the initiative that you're trying to embark upon. So for me, there are set principles that can be modified regardless of the context of how big and or how small the group that you're trying to engage with. And Ms. Lewis may have some other.
Thank you, Dr. Key. This is a real challenging question because I think it really starts at a place of the individual who is involved in the work. It really, in some cases, has to become a passion for ensuring that all people are treated fairly, appropriately, that equity is there, and that the considerations necessary to engage them across all of these, the terms are spectrum systems and you name it, but it really starts with an individual saying, I'm going to make a commitment to ensure that this happens. So then I'm going to work with the next person, and I'm going to work with the next person. And we're going to have these conversations. When we were developing the National Community Committee for the Prevention Research Centers, we encountered the fact that the individual centers across the nations were organized very differently. Some had what were called community advisory committees, community advisory boards. Some had extreme engagement, some had no engagement. They were satisfied to say that we have somebody that we can bring to the table. But when we brought all of those community members together and began to talk amongst ourselves and individually and collectively recognize the varying perspectives about what it meant to be community, it was at that point we began to string some threads across each of the conversations so that we could figure out how to ensure it wasn't just what we were doing in Flint or what was being done in St. Louis, but how do we collectively have a voice? And so we are really challenged right now because this is such a vast conversation and it's going so fast. And I think that's why we ended up with saying, how do you sustain community engagement in an ever-changing health system? It's going to be ever evolving. And I think it is incumbent upon those who have an interest in ensuring the quality of communities' health as a collective, our whole nation's health. It will require all of us to say, what can we do as an individual to make that happen and share that with others?
Really valuable meaning. One last question? Okay. Sir?
To the extent that the learning health system depends on electronic medical records, the emperor has no clothes. So this goes to the question of trust. And big data and little data and a whole number of things. The reason I say that is that the number of mistakes in electronic medical records is frightening.
the number of pregnant men and the number of women with prostate cancer and so on. And it's also a vehicle for fraud that the insurance industries are very concerned about. I mean, that's just the way it's grown up. This isn't really a criticism, it's just a fact. To the extent that we are building the trust of communities, in part, at least, in large part at least, on the value and the reliability and integrity of the data that is out there, we may be misleading ourselves and certainly the communities. I guess my question to you, Dr. Sharp, since you've emphasized the use of all of your data, just one of the kinds of problems that applications like that I know come up with is that there are gaps in the data. And yet when you're trying to study the natural history of some disease, and if someone wasn't present but went outside of your system to have some major piece of work done, and it didn't matter, the data on all of that didn't come back into your system, it is simply wrong data. And you don't know what you don't know, and you know, so on. Anyway, to the extent there are, how can we build a learning health system that really is trusted if at its foundational core we haven't really done new efforts to try to build it on a solid foundation?
That's a great question.
It really is, and I guess I'm stuck with it. I think my reaction is that you're spot on, and that if we try to think about engagement activities in a compartmentalized way, and we say that for the sake of our research, the research activities, we want to have a certain type of relationship with the communities that we serve. We want to engage them in talking about a learning health system. We fail to acknowledge that a lot of the community perceptions and experiences with an institution as big as the University of Michigan's healthcare system are not driven by particular research encounters, right? How the patients that are seen here view the University of Michigan is not often going to be a reflection of their research participation one way or the other. So I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage this kind of activity, the emergence of a learning healthcare system, to foster different types of engagements with your communities, right? Use this as the jumping off point to talk about care activities, to talk about some of the educational activities, some of the public health initiatives that are coming out of the university. Don't limit your engagements just to engagements around the acceptability of proposals related to the creation of a learning health system. I think if we do that, I think you're selling yourself short, but we're also not recognizing the ways in which patients actually come to us and talk with us and have informed opinions about this institution. So more just a reaction, but I agree with the sentiment of your question for sure.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for your great questions, and to our panelists for the wonderful conversation. Feel free to join us for lunch. We're going to be meeting across the hall in seminar rooms A, B, and C. There are 2 food lines, so please don't all get into the same one. Our speakers will each be assigned a different table, so you can sit with the speaker that you would like to engage a little bit more. If you can't join us for lunch, please make sure that you sign up for the mailing list at the registration table and turn in your waiver, your survey, and your badge. And we'll see you back at 12:30.